Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Mark Metry. He's the host of the very popular Humans 2.0 podcast, and he's also the recent author of Screw Being Shy, Learn How to Manage Social Anxiety and Be Yourself in Front of Anyone. A wonderful, wonderful message for everyone out there. Mark, it's wonderful having you here.
Nicholas, thank you so much for having me, man. I hope you're doing well. I hope your audience is also doing well.
Perfect. So for people who don't know about you, could you just give them a brief background as to where you came from and where you are now?
Yeah. So I think this is the way that I'm introducing myself. So, I spent almost every single day of the first 18 years of my life trying to hide from the world, trying to not spread my message about my life, because I thought that if people actually found out who I was, I would be hated, judged, mocked even more. And now that's literally all I do. Now, literally all I do is spread my message and talk to people and help other people, whether that's in the form of my podcast, Humans 2.0, or the book that I have, or the Amazon documentary series I'm a part of, or the business that I run, or when I'm advising companies, or if I'm keynote speaking at like a Fortune 500 organization, or wherever the case may be. That is what I do sort of with my life now.
And what is your message? What is the journey that you've been on?
Yeah. So, personally for me, it's a long story, but, my parents came to this country from Egypt with $200 in their pocket. I didn't really know English. And so there's definitely been a piece of, kind of saying starting from the bottom, at least financially speaking or socioeconomically speaking. I ended up growing up in a town, which was a very small town in the U.S. that had 5,000 people. And the really interesting part about this town was there was no racial diversity whatsoever. And this was also in America at a time where post 9/11 was kind of happening. And so I faced a tremendous amount of racism, abuse. And so after kind of going through that and also going through other like physical health issues as a kid, that really began to set the stage for me having what I know now, which is called social anxiety, which is the most common form of anxiety in America, where basically it makes you feel like in social situations and even non-social situations, it makes you feel like you have like this thing that you have to hide from this world. You have like this perceived deficiency. And if you don't try super hard to hide that, then people are going to judge you, mock you. And so for me, when I was kind of growing up, I really had almost like no friends. I didn't really do much with my life. And so eventually, as I was able to come out of that, I really just realized that, a lot of the information that I had heard was wrong. A lot of my beliefs just weren't in check. They weren't accurate to what the world was actually happening. And there's just, there's so many different things that I had to uncover for me to realize that, this problem that I go through, also tens of millions of people also go through it as well. And some of those people just think that they either have to lowball their entire life or they have to, hide in some way. And so I'm using the platform that I've built out of success to just get this message more out there. Because, if someone like me that was able to turn around his life can do it, and I'm just a normal person, then anyone can. So, it's a message of empowerment, freedom, mental health, love, trust, honesty, truth, using technology for good, trying to do what's right, trying to understand what fear really is. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different parts to my message, but
Fear is definitely an emotion that a lot of creative people suffer from, especially people who have an idea but fear the judgment that comes with putting it out there in the world if it's not perfect yet, or the fear that comes with having something they want to say but not feeling like they themselves have the authority to say it, and they suffer from imposter syndrome. What exactly have you learned about social anxiety, about shyness, that people might get wrong, and what can they do about it?
Yeah. So, when I was making this book, a lot of people were telling me, isn't that just what it's like to be an introvert? And the reality is when you actually look at, for example, being an introvert, the psychology definition is someone who predominantly spends most of their time and energy focusing on the internal world, their thoughts, emotions, feelings, and they get energy from that. And so that has nothing to do with you being nervous to speak to other people. But introverts are definitely more susceptible to this issue. And when it comes to being shy, shyness is a totally natural emotion. Everyone experiences shyness to some degree. If you're doing something new for the first time or you're meeting a lot of people that you don't know, it's totally normal. But there are people who, due to a variety of different reasons, form this pattern where they become shy no matter where they are, no matter who they are talking to, no matter the situation. And that becomes social anxiety. And so when you have social anxiety, essentially what happens is your mind and body form this feedback loop with each other, where when you have a socially anxious thought due to years and years of repetition, your body, your nervous system will activate an emergency response to a perceived threat. And when that happens, your entire body's and brain's neurochemistry shifts. And when it's like that, you don't really have the ability to make the decisions that a free person, quote unquote, could. And so the big thing with this that I've learned is that, when I had social anxiety, I was actually a really social person, but just my brain didn't let me. And so
It's like
social
you're in this
anxiety,
permanent fight or flight mode.
yeah, that's exactly right. And what happens is like you literally lose your free will when that happens. And then what happens is because you don't actually know what's going on later in the day, let's say when you're not in a social setting, you're alone and you're thinking about what you just did, a lot of people don't actually believe that social anxiety is a real thing. And so what they'll do is they'll start to build, feelings of sadness and shame and guilt around acting in that certain way because they feel like for one reason or another, it's their fault. When in reality, it's not really their fault, but it's definitely their responsibility. And so that's like a major thing. And it really just puts you in this cycle. And the real detrimental thing is that social anxiety eventually starts to enter into every single area of your life. And oftentimes what we see is people who have social anxiety, it doesn't just affect them when they're in a social situation, but that actually begins to, tear down their self-esteem. They have no deep relationships, which then begins to get them into the realms of things like substance abuse and social isolation and even suicide and insomnia. And you start to look at these different things and these different factors and just kind of realizing what I went through and the journey that I've been on too, like with my podcast and speaking with, a ton of like neuroscientists, doctors, a lot of other successful people who have struggled with this issue. I was like, man, I literally have to write this book because there's a lot of people out there that are falling into this trap. And the thing is like, if you feel that way, then you can never really express yourself, whether it's online, whether it's in person. And like, I talk to a lot of people that are like trying to be content creators on social media. They're trying to post, or they're trying to be creative publicly somehow. And, the reality is what I've seen a lot, maybe this is just a general observation. we're always growing. Nobody can say like, hey, I've done the growing that I need to do. But I definitely think there is a period where you almost just need to sit back and you just need to realize that, maybe there are a lot of things in your life, on the inside of you that you've neglected. And so whenever it comes to putting something out there at a social level, you're always afraid of that. But the reality is that's not your actual fear. You just have to dig deep down within yourself, generally speaking. And so obviously, everyone's at different levels, but I definitely think there's an importance to, like, before, it comes to posting stuff on social media, I definitely think somebody has to at least start putting in the work outside of social media in their own life on the inside. Because if you do that, then eventually you'll grow as a person and you'll get stronger to where when it does come to posting what you want to post on social media, it's a lot easier to do so. If that
And
makes sense.
it makes so much sense. There's so much pressure on social media as well to give out this perfect image of the life you should be living rather than the life that you're actually experiencing. And sometimes that can make it worse, especially if people already have this anxiety and they see other people are apparently not suffering the same problems that they're suffering.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, a topic that I think is really interesting is like, I'm trying to write this article right now. I'm not exactly sure on the title of it, but I want to talk about this thing that, like, honestly, I think social media, kind of takes our need to be social, like, as sort of a natural component, like a nutrient of everyday life. And it almost like it just, makes it digital. We can put it in our pocket. We can look at it like all the time. It's almost like as human beings, we have a need to be physical and to move throughout the day and to be active. And we just like have this pedometer in our pocket that's counting our steps. And so I think it can be a little bit tricky when it comes to that. But an idea that I've been speaking on is that I think that our need to be perfect, I feel like that's just built into us. Like, I feel like when I was a kid, and maybe it's because I had social anxiety, I don't know. But I remember as a kid, I feel like when I was sitting in a classroom, even like before social media, I remember I would always compare myself to other people. And I would always like, because the thing is like everyone, when you meet people in public, everyone's always trying to put their best selves forward, right? Like they should. But it's like when we see that, we only see just one layer of them. But then, like, when you think about yourself, the many different layers of yourself, and that can be definitely more it can appear more problematic when in reality everybody has similar problems or some layers or depth to that problem. And so I feel like a major part of social media is it's just that similar human characteristic, maybe even that human flaw, and just like putting it up on a screen and you can just access it all the time. But it's I definitely think it's like a natural need that we all have for whatever reason to be perfect. Maybe we're trying to neglect our problems. I don't know, but it's a good question.
I read some research a couple of years ago. There's a part of the brain that effectively gets shut down a little bit when people are being spontaneous. And that's the part of the brain which effectively filters all of the thoughts that you're coming up with to make sure you don't do something stupid. And I believe that I read that part of the brain really only starts developing strongly when you're in your adolescence. So when you're going through these formative teenage years, up until about 25, that's when the brain stops developing. And that might explain why when you're in these formative years, it's the first time you're experiencing these feelings of self-assessment, self-judgment, and really trying not to do something stupid to stand out from people. So that might be why those emotions are so much stronger at that point.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And honestly, I totally agree. I mean, from everything that I've learned, for sure, definitely a major part of even our behavior, even if you're an adult, comes from a lot of the neural pathways that we formed as kids. And I had on this lady, her name is Dr. Loretta Bruning. She's like I forget the name of her title, but she's basically like a biologist and a neurobiologist, and she's written many books. Definitely check her out. But she basically told me that, you know, when an animal is first born, for example, like if you've ever seen a video of like a giraffe being born, like the second it's born, it like already knows how to run, right? But us humans, when we're first born, if you have a baby, like you're just like a sack of just like nothing. Like if someone leaves you alone for 5 seconds, you're screwed. You don't know what to do. And so basically she told me that it takes us a little bit of a while to sort of learn these very basic things in our earlier lives. And while we're doing that, we're in this process where we're just trying to download information and we're making these connections between our internal world and our outside world, between our emotions and between how we feel and how we think and what happens in our environment. And, some examples of this may be, for example, like, you go to school and you get a good grade on a test because, you studied, and you come home and your mom, gives you a hug. So maybe you start to learn in your brain that in order for my parents to love me, I need to spend long hours studying and getting good grades at school. Or let's say, for example, she doesn't hug you, but maybe she gives you a cookie. And then you form this connection in your brain of like, hey, when I do this thing, I get this awesome treat at the end of that. And that treat reminds me of like having my mom's love. So what I've learned is that a lot of these connections get formed very, very early on. And I believe it's like from ages 0 to 7. That's where a lot of like these neural pathways get built in. And from my understanding, what happens is these neural pathways create like these protective shells called myelin sheath. And essentially what happens is those get strengthened over many years and years. And every time that you do one of these behaviors, whether it's positive or negative per se, that pathway gets strengthened. And so it basically becomes this highway where it's much, much, much easier to do things, even if they're harder, like physically speaking, but just because you've built them in like your brain from the time of like when your psyche was first being formed. And so, yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting topic that I go into a little bit in my book, but it's so important for people to understand that, because like a lot of us think that our past doesn't influence our behavior and who we are. And the reality is that, yeah, it absolutely very much does. And you have to be at least mindful of it and do the work.
You've hit the nail on the head there. The myelination of neural pathways, it has a huge impact on creativity as well, because the brain is effectively so hungry that it's and so evolved that it's trained itself to be as efficient as possible. And the most efficient thing it can do is to go back to these proven experiences and memories. And those require a lot less energy to process than taking in new stimulus, processing it, figuring out, is this worth it? Might this work? Might this fail? And that's why it's actually so hard to be creative sometimes. When you're asked a question, the first thing that comes up is the memory of what you've done your entire life. And you then need to effectively force your brain to go beyond that into new, uncomfortable, inefficient territory to come up with new and different ideas.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mark,
no, it's brilliant.
It's been wonderful speaking with you. Sorry I cut you off there, but we're coming up to the end of time. I just want to ask you with one sort of end question. You've obviously done a lot of research and had a lot of experiences in your own life writing this book and speaking with all the people on your podcast about overcoming shyness and about overcoming anxiety. And I'm sure you can speak for hours on the topic, but what's one sort of piece of advice if someone is feeling the sensation, what can you tell them to sort of get into a different mindset?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So this goes a lot with what you were saying before, or just you mentioning creativity. So what I think is a super powerful tool for people to really learn how to use in their lives that could totally change it, that they might already be doing either intentionally or unintentionally. But a really powerful tool that I found and that I've been using in my life, not just for creativity, but really for learning, is flow. And flow is the state of mind that is defined as when you perform your best and you feel your best. And it's like that feeling that when you're super focused on something, next thing you know, you look up and you're like, oh my God, it's been like an hour and a half. I thought it's been like 5 seconds. I didn't even know what happened. I almost like disappeared. And those states of mind, flow, that is what I would try to build into my life. And I've had the people who are probably the most famous for this, both Stephen Collar and Jamie Wheel, who run this the Flow Genome Project. And essentially they talk about the study that was done by McKinsey, where they found that, one of the top 3 factors for predicting somebody's overall happiness and fulfillment in their life is the amount of times that they can get into a state of flow. And so for me, like, I know when I write, for example, I write after I have exercised, I've meditated, I've done some breathing exercises in the morning or usually at night. And for whatever reason, I find that is the easiest time where I can just write in a present state of moment and get into a state of flow. Sometimes when I cook, I get into a state of flow. Sometimes when I'm having a really honest and deep conversation with somebody, I'll be in a state of flow. Sometimes when I go for a walk, I can get into a state of flow. And so there's this topic is pretty complex. And so, I talk about it in my book. I would just say this is something that people can research, but there are all sorts of triggers. There are all sorts of layers to this. And if you can identify those in your own life and try to find as many ways to sustainably and structurally, as long as you're not doing it unhealthy, get into ways of flow, that's like the best way that I could tell you to learn over those, pathways. Because you said that, for example, like every time when you try to do something, your brain gives you that memory of what you did in the past. But if you're able to get in that state of flow, you're not even thinking about that. You're totally in the present moment. And that's really where you begin to learn and you begin to understand, you begin to shift your perspective on these things by actually doing the work and taking action, which makes it totally easier. And yeah, that's always going to happen, but there's a part of you that can understand that, and you can really become like a sort of master if you can learn how to do these things. So I would definitely say for people to look into flow. I have a chapter about it in my book, but people can definitely research it and look it up because it's extremely powerful no matter who you are and what you do.
I've got an article on it on Idea to Value, actually. I'll get that in the link down in the description below. Speaking of which, Mark, it's been wonderful having you here. If people want to find out more about you, your work, your book, whatever you'd like to highlight, where can they go to find out a bit more?
Yeah, if you just go to my website, which is my first and last name.com, markmetry.com, you'll see a link to check out my book, my podcast. You can contact me, check me out on LinkedIn. Any of those things. And Nicholas, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to everyone out there for listening and watching. This has been great.
Thank you so much for having the time for us, and yeah, I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Woo!
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.